In class, we're going to end up taking a look at cell division, which is basically the process where a cell gets bigger and then ends up splitting into two. Before we take a look at how this works, how about if we answer a big picture question, and that is, why would an organism be interested in dividing its cells in the first place? And so if you think about a multicellular organism like us, there's a few good reasons why we'd want our cells to divide. So for example, here's a picture of an embryo at different stages of development. Here it is earlier on in its development, and here it is a little bit later. The reason why embryos get bigger is because this thing right here has cells that are dividing, and after they divide a lot of times, you now have an embryo that's a lot bigger. And so this continues after the embryo or the baby is born. The reason why the baby gets bigger is because it has cells that are dividing to make it big and eventually an adult. So one reason why it's a good idea to have dividing cells if you're a multicellular organism is because it allows you to grow. Another reason why a multicellular organism might be interested in having cells divide is because if they didn't, it wouldn't allow wounds like this to heal. So whenever you get a cut, the reason why at least cuts on the skin eventually heal is because cells divide in order to replace all the cells that end up getting damaged here. So if you didn't have cell division, you'd never have healing like this. So again, what we're going to do is take a look at what all happens during cell division. But before that, how about if we kind of put things into context? And so again, basically what happens when a cell divides, well, first a cell has to be kind of born, has to be made, and then after it's made, it ends up getting bigger before it eventually divides. And so that entire time span where a cell is born until the time when it divides, it's given a name, and that name is the cell cycle. So again, in words, the cell cycle, it's the time period starting when a cell is first born and then ending when the cell divides. Oftentimes you see the cell cycle kind of represented by a clock looking figure, kind of like this. So again, if this is a clock, this whole span here represents the cell cycle, and what this particular figure is showing is that the cell cycle can be divided into two major stages. So there's the interphase portion of the cell cycle, and then there is the mitotic phase portion of the cell cycle. And you see that the interphase portion, which takes up most of the cell cycle's time, the interphase portion can be divided into three subphases. So interphase is made up of G1, S phase, and G2. And then the mitotic phase portion of the cell cycle, that also can be subdivided into two subphases, mitosis and cytokinesis. And so here, how about if we tease this cell cycle apart and point out some things? So again, if you look at this clock that represents the cell cycle, you see that most of the cell cycle, in other words, most of a cell's life, is spent in interphase. And basically during interphase, the cell is just doing what its normal function is. So for example, if you're talking about a kidney cell, then during interphase, that kidney cell would be spending its time filtering fluids, because that's what kidney cells do. If this is a heart cell, then the heart cell would be spending its interphase helping to conduct electrical impulses, which end up pumping blood through the body, because that's what heart cells do. So in writing interphase, this is when a cell performs its normal function. And again, you can see based on this depiction here that the cell spends most of its life, most of the cell cycle in interphase, approximately 90%. If you consider then this mitotic phase, so mitotic phase is when the cell actually divides. So it turns out that mitotic phase occupies only about 10% of the cell cycle. In other words, a cell, if you consider its whole life, it's only spending 10% of its life worried about dividing itself. So here's what we'll do. We'll show you what's happening then during each one of the subphases of interphase, and then show you what's happening during each one of these subphases of mitotic phase. Right, so first, interphase. Again, the cell spends most of its life in this phase. The first part of interphase is called the G1 part. And so some of the major events that occur during G1 are this. So G1 happens, this is the part of a cell's life that happens right after it's born. Right, so here's a cell just newly made. During G1, basically what occurs, the major event, is that the cell physically gets bigger. Right, so that's what you see here. So the major, again, event during G1 is that the cell enlarges. This includes getting bigger just physically in overall size, and it also includes getting more mass inside because organelles are made during G1 if it's a eukaryotic cell. The next portion of interphase is this S phase, and you see here that S stands for something. It stands for synthesis of DNA. So in pictures, here's what that means. So here's a cell, it's leaving G1, it's entering S phase, and the reason why you can tell this cell would be in S phase is because it's going to make DNA. So if you compare this cell before S phase to this cell after S phase, what makes it different is that it has copied, it's made more DNA. Right? So the major event during S phase is that the DNA, the chromosomes, duplicate. Again, makes sense. S stands for synthesis of DNA. So these cells now have more DNA than before S phase. The subphase after S phase is G2. Right? So here's what happens during G2. Basically what occurs is that, so you see that G2, this is the phase right before the cell actually divides. And so in order to divide, there are several proteins that are required for that division. And so basically G2, what happens here, since it's the phase right before the cell divides, it's the phase where the cell gets ready to divide. And it gets ready to divide by making a whole bunch of proteins that are necessary for that cell division to occur. So if you're going to sum up the major event during G2, it's this: the proteins that will help with cell division are made during G2. All right. And so again, after G2 then, that's the last part of interphase. The cell then enters mitotic phase where it actually divides. And so to show you that in pictures, after G2, that's when the cell enters mitotic phase to divide, to produce two cells out of one. All right. Now if you're considering, so if we just focus in now on mitotic phase, we're seeing here that mitotic phase has two subphases of its own called mitosis and cytokinesis. So what's happening during these two subphases of mitotic phase? Here it is. So first, mitosis, that's where it says here when the duplicated chromosomes become separated. So you see that the cell here, as it enters mitotic phase, it has duplicated chromosomes. It has two of every chromosome, right? 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2. And so what we're saying is that during mitosis, what happens is that these chromosomes that are stuck together right now, they actually get separated from one another. Cell division then ends up being completed during cytokinesis. And so if mitosis is when the duplicated chromosomes become separated, cytokinesis is when the cell actually splits in half, when the cell divides to produce the two cells, like this. And so what we'll end up doing then next is we're going to focus in just on mitosis here. So just on the part where the chromosomes separate from one another, and show you what all happens during that particular portion of the life cycle. Okay, so again, just focusing in on mitosis.